Welcome, everyone. I am delighted this morning to introduce Professor Fionnuala ní Aoláin for her European Society of International Law lecture. This is part of the European Society of International Law lecture series and will be available on the European Society's website. This is also the opening lecture of the 2016 annual summer school on transitional justice at the Transitional Justice Institute. I have the privilege to be TJI's director, and Fionnuala is our associate director. I'm delighted to welcome all the participants in this year's summer school, which is always one of the highlights of our academic year. Our summer school attracts an exceptionally high-quality cohort, and I have no doubt your discussions this week will be fascinating. TJI is a law-led multidisciplinary research institute with some 30 staff and research students, as well as 20 master's students, researching and studying in the areas of transitional justice, human rights, international law, peace, and conflict. TJI was the first and is the longest established university research institute addressing the theme of transitional justice. 4 features of our research stand out. We encourage multidisciplinary research. We have colleagues with backgrounds in politics, gender, sociology, psychology, as well as in law and different socio-legal studies. We focus on research that has real-world impact. Our staff are concerned with problems in the world and engage with stakeholders in their research, education, and civic contribution missions. We are international in our orientation. Across our staff, PhD researchers, and master's students, we have nationals from Australia, China, Colombia, Denmark, Germany, Iran, Italy, the Netherlands, Japan, Spain, South Africa, and the US. And we pursue world-leading excellence in our research, as is clear from the prizes won by our staff for their publications, from the American Society of International Law, from the Socio-Legal Studies Association, and others. These qualities led to our research being officially ranked first in the United Kingdom for our impact in law. This was determined in the UK's Independent Assessment of Research Quality, the Research Excellence Framework 2014. We were also ranked 4th overall of more than 60 law units across the United Kingdom. And I'm delighted to see our summer school students, participants every year, because they reflect those 4 qualities: multidisciplinary background, a concern with real-world impact, an international orientation, and the pursuit of excellence. That achievement in the Research Excellence Framework and our ongoing work is the result of contributions by many people both within the Institute and in Ulster University. However, it certainly would not have been possible without a shaping vision and academic leadership. Fionnuala has been one of the key people providing that leadership in her role as one of the 3 founders of the TJI, along with Professor Christine Bell and Professor Colin Campbell, and more recently as Associate Director working on our research planning, which led to our success in REF 2014. Fionnuala holds a joint appointment with the University of Minnesota, where she holds the Robina Chair in Law, Public Policy, and Society. She is an internationally recognized expert in the fields of transitional justice, international law, feminist legal theory, counterterrorism law. She has held positions at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, Princeton University, and Harvard University. She has served as a member of the Irish Human Rights Commission and was nominated by the Irish government to the European Court of Human Rights, the first woman and the first academic to be so nominated. She has worked with Open Society, UN Women, and the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. I'm very delighted to acknowledge once more the support of the European Society of International Law for this lecture, and I now invite Fionnuala to deliver her lecture at the start of our summer school.
Thank you. So colleagues and TJI Summer School faculty and students, it's a pleasure to be here again at the 7th annual TJI Summer School. And I'm really pleased to deliver this opening lecture, which is being supported by the European Society of International Law. It's worth remembering that the founding meeting of the European Society of International Law took place in 2001 in Florence, Italy. It was convened by Philip Alston, Antonio Cassese, Marie-Pierre Dupois, Bruno Zimmer, and Joseph Weiler. Their vision to establish a European network that would bring together and deepen understandings among people working in the field of international law was an admirable one. They wanted to develop that understanding between people working in the field of international law, whether they were government officials, diplomats, legal advisors, academics, or practicing lawyers. And it seems to me today that that vision and the value of a common European heritage and the appreciation of international law is both poignant and particularly resonant in Belfast. I want to thank my colleague, Professor Rory O'Connell, for that warm and very generous and far too generous introduction and his ongoing support to my work. I want to also thank my many collaborators and colleagues at TJI who continue to inspire my research and writing and make it feel both heartfelt, intrinsically valuable, and worthwhile, both locally and on a global scale. And so what I want to do today as we open our summer school is to chart a deeper understanding of political settlement and peacemaking, to map out some of the relevant terrain of these areas, and in that context to fashion a feminist and gendered understanding of what political settlement and the often messy, incoherent, and invariably stop-start of peacemaking as well. Let me start with political settlement. The concept of political settlement has entered the mainstream lexicon of peacemaking, political stabilization, and active bilateral engagement in fragile and conflict-affected zones. Despite this increased pervasiveness, which I'm sure many of you have encountered in your work, this vocabulary is it's sort of favored by some policymakers, not by all, but it's suffered, and it's very lightly present in scholarly and policy literatures. And part of the reason why, as we grapple with this new language, we're trying to understand how it is that certain words, phrases, and concepts come into fashion at a particular point, that they take on a particular life, a particular resonance in political and legal discourses, and what the impact of the adoption of certain kinds of new concepts and practices mean in general for political settlement and for peacemaking, but more particularly for women. So as this language of political settlement becomes normalized in bilateral and multilateral discourses of states and institutions managing conflicts, I think it particularly behooves us as feminists to understand its meaning and its purchase. For this group in this room, many of you are working on the ground in conflict zones. And so staying pace with these shifting ideas, with these shifting vocabularies, with these shifting concepts is not just sort of conceptually important, but it has utilitarian and practical value. Pragmatically, when the language and the concept frames shift, so too do economic and political priorities, and the money generally follows. So attention to political settlement is important for those of us engaged in peace building and conflict transition, in part because the new language and the new policies that follow it deeply affect the messages that key actors and key institutions internalize, and in turn they expect that language and those concepts to come back to them. So what do we mean when we say political settlement? Well, actually a fixed meaning of the term political settlement is still in play. It's not quite fixed yet. There are some examples. For example, the UK's Department for International Development, DFID, which has in part supported the summer school at the TJI this year, defines political settlement in a very broad way. It talks about, quote, the expression of a common understanding usually forged between elites about how power is organized and exercised. And so that definition, that idea of common understanding between elites and organizing power is a pretty broad one. And a couple of general features follow, I think, from that definition. One is the idea that political settlement is some kind of relationship between state and society. Second, that political settlement operates as a two-level game. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that it operates as a set of interactions and relationships between differently placed elites and then reproduces those dynamics between elites and their followers. Now, as we're going to see, and as I'm going to talk about at some length in this lecture, understanding the role and the importance of elites in political settlement is critical, and it poses particular challenges and particular new terrain for a gender analysis. So, at the heart, it seems, of this consensus on political settlement is the idea that ending protracted conflict in violent and conflict-affected states requires co-opting elites in various alignments with their various interests and doing so by offering them various inducements and incentives to come into political process. So inclusion conversations are at the heart of the discourse of political settlement. But it's not possibly inclusion the way you and I might define it, at least not from a feminist perspective. So when this word inclusion arises, we often, I think of the possibility of some kind of transformative discourse, right? That something could open up, that there would be space created. And in particular, that space would allow women to be present on equal terms. But I remain somewhat skeptical as to whether or not political settlement can deliver any better on that promise of including women than other arenas have. And here I include classic peace agreement discourse, as well as the discourses of the women, peace and security agenda. And I'm going to explore some of those challenges today. One of the problems here when we try to insert gender into political settlement analysis is that the term by most of the, and I should put in brackets, men who write about it, is that it's assumed to be gender blind. When we say the word political settlement, it sounds sort of like a table, gender blind, like there's no specificity of gender attached to it. And really, there's been very, very little by way of comprehensive analysis available on the gendered component and the gendered form of political settlement. And that's really the work that the Transitional Justice Institute and many of the scholars in this room have been engaged in over the past year as we've embarked on a major research project on political settlement supported by DFED. There are some literatures that speak to the gender component of political settlement. They include the peace agreement literature that we're going to talk about this week as well. They include literatures on political participation by women, women and state building, and some conflict management literature that to a greater or lesser degree includes women. And there's a pretty big conceptual overlap between some of the ideas that you find in political settlement discourse and the ideas that we find underpinning the women, peace and security agenda. In all of these arenas, at least when we include a gender dimension, a really high premium is placed on including women into the prevention, negotiation, and enforcement of conflict ending. But I think we have to, and that's what I'm going to try to do today, is tease out much more critically what it means to do that work. We need to understand, I think, the extent to which the emerging practices of political settlement come with very well-established gender norms. So this may be a new concept, but it sort of comes with a pile of baggage. And that baggage significantly includes gender practices and gender ordering. What do these norms look like? And how would we modify or correct these norms to take greater account of women in the negotiations from conflict, or the engagement of women in ensuring the sort of the keeping or the maintenance of peace. Now, what I'm going to do, 3 things this morning. I'm going to, as I've already sort of laid out this landscape, this definition of political settlement. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that definition. I'm then going to talk a little bit about feminist theorizing, and in particular look at feminist institutional theory, to talk about the ways in which institutions suffer from gender deficits, and how hard it is, even when you have women included, to undo the gender frames and the gender practices of institutions. And then I want to conclude by looking at a sort of a way forward and try to think about how we might revision or envision political settlement and peacemaking in a way that is centrally inclusive of women's needs, hopes, and aspirations. So in practice, so talking a little bit more to start about political settlement practice, we've seen a lot of studies on political settlement in countries as diverse as Cambodia, India, South Africa, the Solomon Islands, Belgium, Venezuela. But the countries I'm most interested in and the sites that we're mostly going to focus on today are sites of conflict, or sites emerging from political repression. So what is a political settlement? We have this definition from DFID. We've talked about how open it is and how intrinsic elites are to that definition. But when we talk about political settlement in conflict, we're talking about essentially an agreement reached between generally parties who have previously been in dispute, mostly violently, to engage politically, to negotiate politically, to mediate and to barter politically. And so when we think about the kinds of sites in which that bartering, that negotiation, that mediation is taking place, I think of a place like Northern Ireland, a place that historically had disputes or conflicts that were rooted in sectarian, ethnic, ideological, resource-defined, territorial, and cultural differences. And those differences have propped up and created a practice of politics which is underpinned by violence. And that violence, we have to understand a little bit about that violence to understand the kind of settlement that emerges from that violence. That violence is often inherently located in ethno-national masculinist discourses, where gendered nationalism, and by that I mean gendered nationalism that exalts a particular kind of what a colleague of mine here at TJI has called the armed patriarchy, to continue to engage in violence. That armed patriarchy and the violence that it produces is long-term, it's cyclical, it's highly disparate in its forms, it is invariably destructive of civilian lives, civilian infrastructure, and the civility that enables diverse humanity to thrive in political communities. That violence is also gendered, because very specific forms of gender-based violence and situated gendered harms follow in these violent or conflict sites. As many of you in the room know, and as we've talked a little bit about this morning already, women directly experience conflict-related impact, and much of that impact is related to sexual violence. That includes unwanted pregnancies, sexually transmitted diseases, community stigma, and the physical harm that follows from extreme physical violence being meted out on your body. In addition to that, women experience the kind of harms that follow from the impact of violence on communities and socially determined family structures. This doesn't happen violence doesn't happen in a neutral universe. It happens in a universe of ordered gender roles and expectations. And so the way that violence falls is infinitely and profoundly gendered. The impact of economic devastation is profoundly gendered. The impact of forced displacement is profoundly gendered. The impact of health deterioration from violence, from conflict-related violence, is gendered. And the loss of education in highly gender-stratified ways is inherently gendered. And so there's increasing recognition that these range of harms befall women, that they are not gender neutral, and that countries that are emerging from conflict, at least theoretically, should be addressing in a gender-inclusive way the range of economic, social, political, and physical harms that have occurred to women as a result of conflict. Now, when we think of political settlement inserting itself into this terrain of political, economic, social, cultural, physical harm, we're seeking some kind of, again, going back to our definition, engagement of elites to transcend these profound violences and the dysfunction that has produced them. But there's some really complicated question when we are expecting that work to be done by elite actors. It behooves us to notice that generally those elite actors are men. And those are the men who are most likely to be engaged in that bartering and exchange and interest-based, if you want, negotiation with one another, are often the men who've been most violent, the men who are at the heart of the inducement process. And so I think when you marry together the range of harms and the fundamental definition of what constitutes political settlement, we hit some walls, I think, from a gender perspective. It really requires us to ask what kinds of gendered fault lines have and are emerging in political settlements. Now, it forces us, I think, to understand that when elites are at the heart of a negotiation, at the heart of political settlement process, there are insider and outsider dynamics that are manifest and that will consistently, the benefits will consistently accrue to system insiders, those who have accumulated the military prowess that I've described, those who have inbuilt advantages of racial wealth and property benefits in existing systems. And so I want to suggest that there's a huge overlap between those accumulated benefits in these systems, whether they're military, whether they're wealth-based, whether they're race-based, with masculinities and with existing gender orders. And I think understanding that there's this embedded gender order in place long before you get to political settlement that has some determinative effects on what the substance and the process of the political settlement itself will look like is absolutely critical to understanding the gendered terrain in which political settlement is included. So how should feminists approach this gender order? Laura Semple has argued that when we look at political or peace process or any kind of engagement, she argues that we have to argue for processes that value equality and inclusion, that interrogate structural hierarchies, and that examine existing forms of oppression. We have to assume, I think, that theories constructed by men, about men, presuming men, and assuming masculinity are partial, not only because they leave out women as people, but substantively because they leave out and devalue the feminine in all of these processes. So at its most basic, gender analysis in political settlement or in peace agreement making is crucial to understanding the presence or absence of women, but it's also really crucial to understanding the meaning and representation of women in these settings. It's not enough to think about whether they're there or whether they're not there. It's critical to understand that once they're there, and by they I mean women, or gender non-conforming men, whom I think also ought to be included in this analysis, that we have to understand what kind of value or representation is given to them once they enter the space. Because gender orders are produced by and reinforced by gender normative understandings of how people do and should act and live. And they're not divorced from the way life is read and experienced. And what gender orders do, and many of you who work in highly patriarchal settings or in settings where those gender orders are really obvious in terms of who does what and what is valued and who is valued. Gender orders normalize, I'm going to quote here Cynthia Enlow's, the marginalization, subordination, and exploitation of feminized practices or persons, such that routine feminization is associated with routinized devalorization. So it's important to underscore what I'm trying to say here is not so much that feminization is limited to people understood to be female or women, but it extends to people, states, processes, and actors that display or are seen to display traits associated with femininity. So it's really not about having a woman in the room. It's about the assumption that certain ways of acting or negotiating or mediating are in themselves feminine and therefore undervalued. So it doesn't really matter whether it's a woman or a man doing that work. It's the kind of value we ascribe to a certain way of doing and compromising around violence. So to be clear, it's not only subjects or people that can be feminized, but also concepts, desires, tastes, styles, ways of knowing, ways of being masculinized and feminized. And this kind of gendering occurs in everyday life. It occurs in all of our lives, all of the time. But what's most important for us to understand in the context of political and legal analysis is that it has global social and political impact. And that it is not just happening. It's not just that the private or the personal is political. It's that this manifests in the way in which things are ordered. And so these two manifestations of this, I think, that are particularly relevant to political settlement and to peacemaking are, first of all, that the organization of things, people, actors, behavior, are perceived to be in conformity or not with gender-sensitive orders. Those that are seen to be in conformity with masculine orders are generally valorized, valued, lauded, appreciated, and those that are not are seen to be devalorized and marginalized. And I think we're seeing some really interesting examples of this in peace process work at the moment. One is in Kosovo, most recently where, because the delegation of, a delegation made up of women, or a significant number of women, came back in the process of political negotiation. And what we saw was a very masculinist response to the deal that was made. The deal itself was devalorized by the Parliament of Kosovo on the basis that it was overly feminine. That they had lost out something partly because the values and the compromises in the deal themselves were seen to reflect feminine values, not masculine values. I think we've seen similar aspects of this in the context of the Philippines and in the Mindanao process, which we will talk about later in the week. The second thing to understand is that gender is deeply hierarchical in global political practice. And by extension, it is profoundly hierarchical in peace process and political settlement practice. And so I really want to emphasize how important it is for us to understand that kind of fundamental system-level instinct before we even get to unpicking peace process and political settlement. Because it's understanding the centrality of those gender orders in everyday life and their practice, the way in which they are picked up and normalized in political settlement and in peacemaking, helps us understand why, even with the presence of women or the greater emphasis on representation for women, we don't always deliver on the substance of gender transformative change in societies that are coming out of conflict. So I think one of the challenges, and let me just say a little bit about gender exclusion. As we know, if we're focused on political settlement as a process that is fundamentally and primarily concerned with the engagement of elites, it's actually not uncomplicated to find large numbers or significant numbers of elite women in these processes. And so what we've seen, and one of the things I think we have to be deeply concerned with, and it's about representation, it goes back to which woman is present, is understanding that the selective inclusion of elite women whose claim to presence in either peace process or political settlement processes may rest on their indisputable relationship to elite and powerful, an elite or powerful man or men in a clan-based system, may in fact disguise the unrestrained entrenchment of a masculine worldview with the veneer of female legitimacy. And we shouldn't take for granted that the presence of even a small number of uncompromised women in negotiation and mediation spaces underscores a particular problem identified by feminist political sociologist Carol Smart. She describes the challenge of challenging a form of power without accepting its own terms of reference, and hence losing the battle before it's even begun. Right? So, I've spoken to the challenge of elite, of maintaining elite buy-in, of valuing elite skills, strategies, and choices, and focusing on elites alone to help advance both political settlement and peacemaking process. At the end of the day, we have to understand that focusing on elite engagement, even if they stop violence, can essentially valorize and empower elite, generally militarized men in ways that we don't anticipate. And so it's not enough for there to be a peace deal. And it's certainly not enough for there to be a political settlement if all we have done is essentially produce realigned political processes that protect masculine benefits and ill-serve women's interests. So let me talk a little bit about institutionalism now. So institutionalism requires us, I think, to answer a couple of very interesting questions. One, what happens in practice? How do these institutions, and when I say institutions, I'm thinking about a peace process as an institution. I'm thinking about political settlement and the kinds of institutional structures it creates. And to think about how those structures and those processes address women's needs, demands, and challenges. What women are present, what kinds of interests are included. And so I think to do this, you have to, I love, Cynthia Enloe has this wonderful phrase about deploying a feminist curiosity as to why things sort of turn out the way they do. And so I think we have to employ a feminist curiosity about the ways in which outcomes and institutional preferences often serve to highlight or advance the interests of elite men and their followers, but rarely operate to serve the dynamic and shifting needs of women. And so one way to think about this is to think about how the rules of the game are played. To think about both the formal and informal rules that concentrate and enable power to be divided in political settlement and in peace agreement. And so one of the things that I've found really useful in this context is to think about the structure of institutions and how women get into those institutions. One piece of it we've talked about already, which is representation. Who are the elites? Who are actually present in these contexts? But the second is understanding the social norms and the kind of small I institutionalism that emerges in peace process practice and in political settlement process. And many feminist institutional scholars have argued that we have to really take seriously what they call the social stuff of political process and institutions. The social stuff is axiomatic to the workings of elite interchange and exchange, and it actually operationalizes masculinity in institutional settings. It helps us understand why women's interests are often marginalized in political settlement. So what do I mean by the social stuff? Well, the social stuff includes the kind of performative entry points to closed bargaining spaces. It's the kind of social capital that you have when you come into a political or social space. It's the ways in which you have or you don't have the salient markers of elite identity, networking capacity, as well as the capacity to move within power arenas. So let's try to think about this in peace process or political settlement negotiation. Sometimes we think the most important place to get to is the table of the negotiation. And what we fail to realize is actually the deal got done before we ever got to the table, or that the deal was done in the men's bathroom, which we didn't have access to. And so part of it, and I'm being facetious, but I'm talking about the ways in which there's formal spaces of power, which we place a huge amount of effort and energy on accessing, and then there are these informal spaces. And it's in these informal spaces that women frequently don't have access. And for me, the work that's most influenced the way I think about this is the work of political scientists like Louise Chappell and Georgina Whalen, who look at who've advanced a field of feminist analysis of political institutions. And what they look at is they precisely look inside institutions. They look at the formal and informal practices, the codified rules, but more importantly, the unwritten expectations. The places where the deals look like they get made, but actually the places where they are made. And so what they understand and what they've meticulously documented, and what I think is critically important to do in the area of peace process and peace and political settlement, is to understand the big spaces and the small spaces. To be really aware that even as we gain access to the formal spaces of negotiation, there are these other gender-ordered spaces that are entirely closed off to us, or to which we have minimal access. And so close attention, feminists have to pay close attention to the wide gap that exists between formal and informal institutional power. We have to be aware of these socially shared rules, these usually unwritten rules that are created, communicated, and enforced outside officially sanctioned channels. We have to understand that, as Anne-Marie Goetz has described, there is gender capture of political process, gender capture of peace agreements, gender capture of political settlement processes, which follows from men's historical and modern dominance of power positions within organizational structure. And so that idea of gender capture underscores the point that even when women gain access to elite spaces through gender mainstreaming or through open appointment processes, their capacity to change the institutional rules of the game, how the deals get done and who makes them, may in fact be extremely limited. And this is as true for constitutional or national political settlement as it is for peace agreement and the kinds of political spaces in which military, political, economic and legal power is being dispensed and bargained for. Let me say a couple of words about intersectionality before I conclude on some ideas about a way forward. My colleague Aoláin Rooney will be speaking later this week about the importance of bringing an intersectional analysis. What do we mean by intersectionality? And intersectionality is a way of understanding, and it's an analytical tool that allows us to scrutinize how often the most marginalized women's experiences of harm, whether it's in the workplace, in the home, whether in institutions, how the multiple identities of women often get lost in the process of legal and political responses to their positions. I think intersectionality allows us to see the multiple dimensions of race, not just gender, but race, ethnicity, religious affiliation, nationalist identity, whatever it may be. It allows us to get multiple understandings of how women are situated. And one of the challenges, and just this is really the point I want to underscore about political settlement and peace agreement, we're often working so hard to get one or two women into the room that intersectional analysis just falls out completely. In the context of Northern Ireland, would it be a Protestant woman or a Catholic woman? Would it be some neutral woman who says she doesn't connect to either of these traditions? What does the woman who stands in the negotiation context, for whom does she stand? And of course, one might ask the same question about men, but we rarely do, because we're not working to get men into these processes. But understanding intersectionality, placing intersectionality at the heart of the way we think about political settlement and of peace agreements, allows us to understand who's being left out and the consequences of how they're left out for broader political processes. All right. Let me close by talking about the way forward after possibly a very depressing view of where we are at right now. The way forward is hard, not just because I think the gender orders in the context of political settlement and peace agreement are located in the masculinities and femininities of a particular political space, but let's not forget that part of these gender orders are also about internationals, people who populate the space of political settlement and peace agreement. As scholars like Cockburn and Zakov have argued, post-conflict environments like conflict are vividly about male power systems, struggles, and identity formation. There's often enormous flux in post-conflict societies about male identity. Men who were in power are losing power. Other men are taking their places. And as often the case when these kinds of stalemates arise, essentially, these internationals are culturally and politically differentiated other men are taking their place. And this international fraternity that often arrives in to fix the problem, they're a community of decision makers who arrive with their own gender hierarchies intact. They hold the moral and often the economic upper hand. And while they're lauded for sort of saving societies from the worst of their own excesses, what's often little appreciated is that they come with their own gender norms, their own patriarchal behaviors, and they transpose them into the spaces in which they come to, including, as we've seen in places like the Central African Republic, with sexual violence. So we can't assume in this space that there's sort of some third international savior out there going to do the work differently. And we have to assume that they, in fact, are part of the problem. So that's the first place we start from, is understanding that these aren't just local problems, these are global problems. But understanding that, we have to figure out how we create processes that move societies past structural chauvinism, past sustained violence, past the perpetuation of sharp inequalities and the loss of civic trust. And at the heart of this for me is the understanding that the primary vehicle forward is improving not just political representation, but the economic capacity and well-being. And for many feminist scholars, including myself, it is this central emphasis on social and economic protection, as well as the sort of broader political compromise, that is at the heart of how we see a way forward. Transformative political settlement isn't just about figuring out who's at the table. It's actually about fundamentally negotiating economic goods and who gets to be the beneficiaries in any new political orders. So for me, the transformative place forward is actually to recognize and to centralize the idea that it is in fact economic growth, economic inclusion, and sustainable development that have to be centrally engaged in political settlement and peacemaking in order to enable women's equality and autonomy. I think, secondly, in order to sort of engage a transformative project, we have to stop tinkering with inclusionary rules. And by inclusionary rules, I mean setting aside a couple of random seats at negotiating tables or appointing more connected and acceptable women to sit on new or revitalized institutional bodies that essentially just do more of the same. What I think it requires from feminists is a sustained attention to and remedy of institutional exclusion and naming both the formal and informal places in which power is exercised. and doing work on both. It also requires a deep reach into intersectional politics to reach beyond the easy representation offered by the woman who fits easily. It's hard to do this. It's been hard to do it in Northern Ireland because the move to a transformative politics is always constrained by the ferocity of the prior violence and the moves that prompted settlement in the first place and the danger of backsliding. So we understand that at the heart of all of this is always the ever-present fear of violence. But I think allowing violence to dominate, the fear-mongering of violence, is its own set of chains. So the third thing I would say is that we have to be prepared to stand back from deals that are not good for us. Often there's a desire just to make a deal, any deal. And what we lose in that process is these set of compromises that look good in the short term limit the broader and long-term transformative aspects of a peace deal. A bad peace deal, I think, is worse than no peace deal at all. I would say that these compromises, these short-term compromises that really foreclose transformation in the long term, work the least well for women, who are generally unlikely to be in military camps. And when they're excluded from the benefits of such deal, will have little or no capacity to make long-term change. We've seen much of this discussion in the Women, Peace and Security agenda over the past 15 years. The idea that we just keep working to get women in. And my feeling right now is that's just not good enough. It's not working well on its own terms, but it's certainly not delivering transformative peace process. In conclusion, I would also say that one of the challenges in this space is to recognize agency and resistance. That one of the challenges when we talk about women, and I've done this at the beginning of this lecture today, is to focus on the harms that women have experienced in conflict. And they are real, and they are extensive, and they are extraordinarily compelling. But the danger of focusing on those harms is that is all that we see. And what it does is that it traps us in an ever non-ending cycle of victimization and protectionism, what feminist scholars have called the protection racket, from which women rarely ultimately benefit. And so there's this really odd balance that has to be struck, which is the balance of recognizing the harms that women have experienced while simultaneously affirming women's agency and resilience. And that resilience, I think, that understanding that women, in fact, are capable and transformative agents of change, is at the heart of what a revised or revisioned political settlement and inclusive gendered order for peace agreements might look like. So we'll pause there. We're going to take, I think, about 10 minutes of questions before we close the lecture. Thank you. So I'm happy to take any questions. Yeah, go.
I couldn't agree more with everything you said, absolutely everything. I was extremely frustrated in Ukraine, especially, not just by the exclusion of women, by this also masculinization and militarization of women by themselves, which is what I found the most big challenge in the work of the political process,
right,
etc. So, and looking at my own country, I went back to my own country, Italy. I see this in politics. It's not a conflict situation, but it's a very tense political situation that I hope would not turn into a conflict.
Yeah.
Combined with all the economic challenges, technological challenges of our times that are changing the situation upside down, so they pose additional challenges to political and economic stability.
Yeah.
So I am also quite pessimistic, and I keep wondering, how can we transform, because we still don't have a critical mass, I mean, women, or let's say, more feminized men who are gender champions, do not have yet critical mass to enact this transformative agenda. And we are facing, I think, unprecedented historical challenges, even in conflict in countries that are not in armed conflict. So I really don't know where to start with, and sometimes I'm very frustrated because, okay, beyond the long-term process of increasing women's participation, just, you know, the quantitative aspects of it, let's say, and let alone the qualitative aspects that are where men's participation and the transformation of masculinity is absolutely key. But it's such a long-term process, and we're facing such big historical challenges on all fronts that I really sometimes wonder where can we start? You know, especially since in Italy I see, but I saw it in Ukraine and other countries, this masculinization of women.
So I would say, I think one of the benefits of an intersectional approach is that actually we understand that women have been active protagonists of conflict in many societies for millennia. And so I think indisputably the greater attention to women combatants, understanding that women have been combatants, have been actively engaged in conflict, but also you don't need to have a gun to be a combatant. And women, there are lots of ways in which, I mean, I think of mothering as a good example of this, that women mother in ways that can perpetuate conflict. We raise children who, with ethno-national discourses in ways that encourage a certain valorization of masculinity, both with sons and daughters. So I think there's an increasing acknowledgement of the complexity of roles that women play, and I actually think that's a really positive move, partly because it breaks up this woman as victim motif and allows us to see the much more complex roles that women play in society. And I may sound pessimistic, but one thing I think we should think about as being positive with lots of caveats, if you think of the power of the women, peace and security space, I mean, there's lots of challenges with that space. But if you think about the number of Security Council resolutions that have been passed since 2001, if we think about the sort of global articulation of a concern for women's issues, and don't get me wrong, it's a problematic space. Angelina Jolie and the kind of star-studded kind of capture of that space has its own complexity. But nonetheless, it speaks to not so much the margins, but some kind of mainstream acceptance for a certain women's politics in peace and security. And I think that's a space, and some of it is about taking that space back in particular ways. Some of it is about the actors who are engaged in that space, whether as advocates and practitioners, as scholars, being much prepared to be critical about the work we ourselves are doing in this space, and in fact pushing that space. And the third area I think that's really significant is the capacity for women to recapture spaces of peacemaking and peace activism. And so one of the challenges of the Women, Peace and Security agenda is that we've sort of accepted, essentially, that ordeal for being protected in war is that it's okay to go to war. It's a very crude approximation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, but it speaks to a certain tolerance for the fact of conflict. And there is a much older history of women's activism going back to the Hague conferences, going back to the League of Nations, and going back to earlier historical practice by women of actually actively engaging in peace. And not peace in the sense of kind of victimized peace, but women actively shaping and speaking to the global politics in terms of peace and security. And so I do think there are these spaces, and some of it is really about engaging the community of practitioners and scholars, many of you are in this room, about rethinking the space that we're in and not accepting its limits and being prepared to step outside of it strategically at particular moments. Yeah.
Because I think following also what Robina said, that basically every time that we have, let's say, conferences, you know, where we have women activists and many politicians, there is always this need to explain why women should be there. We always have to justify with one reason or the other, you know. And very often, there are also a lot of gender stereotypes brought by women, say because we are as a mediator. And I think also we fall in a trap because not all women are mediators, not all women have this kind and caring qualities. And what annoys me is really this need to justify all the time what actually should be a right, to be represented and to represent the population. And I wanted to have your opinion on one thing. I mean, talking to different feminists, my opinion is that we need to have men on board to make changes. Yeah. But some people I know, I work with, they are absolutely against it because they say that they have already a lot of space. If we give them space, to have more space ourselves, then we're giving more power again. So it's like when I think we're stuck, the approach that we're using is not working. Yeah. I mean, we talk a lot about men involvement, but it's happening at like 1%. Yeah. Because every conference I go to, I'm also here, how many men we have? And it's all this thing. So I feel all the time we meet to convince ourselves of what we're already convinced. Yeah. So
it's difficult. So I think gender essentialism, there's this really complicated space which is around invoking certain essentialist feminine attributes to justify your inclusion. So better mediators, better peace, kinder, gentler. And I think women are quite smart about how they do that, actually. I think they understand, not many, not all, but many women who operate in complex political settlements understand when they're invoking essentialism strategically. The key point is to know that that's what you're doing and not to get stuck there, right? Because often we have to be smart about how we get into the political space. So I recognize the real challenges of gender essentialism. But I think we're not likely to lose it in the short term. And so the key is how do we operationalize that in a way that doesn't essentially undo a transformative project. But you're right about this question of who's speaking to whom and where's the action happening. It seems quite extraordinary to me that this remains. It's true of most women, peace and security conferences involve women. Go to a terrorism conference, let me tell you, there'll be 5 women there, or very few women there. So there are these highly gendered spaces of peace and security in the terrain. How do we change that? I do feel, and my colleagues here, Monica and others, will be talking throughout the week, that one of the ways in which transformation or change took place in Northern Ireland, we have a very compelling story about the engagement of women political actors through the Women's Coalition. But actually that work was done in cooperation and in friendship with a large, large group of civil society actors. That it was women, there was certainly a space for women's activism, but it happened in a cooperative and really highly engaged way with other civil society actors. And it is that kind of critical friendship that I think remains really critical. And, finally, I just say, increasingly we're paying more attention to masculinities. We are thinking about what happens to men in conflict. Perhaps counterintuitively, I find that the discourses around male victimhood are really important in this regard. And one of the reasons they're important is that they remind us that men are vulnerable in conflict. They remind us that if you're a young man between the ages of 17 and 40 living in numerous countries around the world, you are no longer presumed a civilian. The working assumption is that you're a combatant who can be hit by a drone or another form of device, that you forego your civilian status by virtue of your gender. And so we have, I think, much to say about what it means to understand men and boys as being vulnerable, not just to sexual violence in conflict, but vulnerable to death, vulnerable to maiming, vulnerable to long-term injuries that will ensure their lack of capacity to live full and live lives. So sometimes it's that mosaic that kind of complicates the picture in ways that helps undo these essentialisms. But it is very, very, very slow work. This is true. Take one more question, and then we're going to have coffee. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was just so rich in terms of content and thinking. I'm just wondering if you've thought about how best to influence the institutions that are kind of perpetuating and sustaining this perspective, and I'm thinking from the point of view of supporting autonomous feminist movements.
Yes.
And what is happening more and more, where there is this kind of language of, the Sustainable Development Goals, and we've seen most recently with the Dutch Ministry with the Flow 2 funding that was supposed to be supporting women's movements for change, but it actually prioritised a lot of the international NGOs,
Right.
And really gave very little material support to strong women's movements, women's funds, women's organising
Right.
from a grassroots perspective.
Yeah.
And so that rich ability to be able to influence systems and institutions and to be able to really build on an incredible track record of women ending civil wars, getting women presidents elected, changing systems, was really discredited or marginalised in favour of international NGOs. And so what you were saying about the whole economic system is really exactly what we're seeing with governments now prioritising for-profit managing contractors and international NGOs, and really discrediting the incredible contribution that particularly autonomous feminist movements have to be able to achieve what you've been talking about.
Yeah, no, I'm in absolute. So I think we're seeing a couple of things. One is that the global women's movement has been profoundly weakened. And we've seen that, I think, a sort of steady weakening of the global international women's movement. And I think there's an important and really critical role for funders in shoring up the global women's movement, particularly in the global south. For a whole variety of reasons, structural reasons, not unconnected to what you've described as the kind of weakness at the grassroots level, which ultimately ought to be feeding up to the creation of a strong and sort of self-sustaining. Now, the global women's movement has to take some responsibility for that too. Some of that is around leadership and the unwillingness and inability of the global women's movement to renew itself, particularly with younger actors. We see a large amount of mobilization. I think of marriage equality in the United States or in the Republic of Ireland, and the real engagement by young women and men in those sort of transformative social movements. And feminist movements have some work to do to capture the same kind of mobilization. So I think that there's both external and internal ways in which that could be done. I fully concur that one of the challenges, and interestingly enough, one of the greatest places of weaknesses, and those of you who come from conflict zones might concur with our experience in Northern Ireland, is that often it's in the aftermath of the conflict that the women's movement is most weakened. Many women are co-opted into the institutions of governance, so the actual grassroots structures start to sort of weaken. And also funding disappears. Conflict's over, we're going to find another conflict, so we don't have to fund you anymore. And that creates then the way in which the peace gets shored up, gets undermined. And in particular, the capacity of women's movements to speak to the chipping away of core elements of peace agreements that serve women's interests, their capacity is profoundly diminished. And I would say that's not just women's movements, it's also civil society, actually, in general, that we lose something in the aftermath. So there's there's a fundamental lesson to be learned there, which is about staying the course with post-conflict societies, particularly in shoring up civil society movements in post-conflict societies as actually your a safeguard on the peace process itself and of the ability to maintain a liberal and functional peace. Finally, I'd just say about institutions, I think there's some really interesting work that tells us that there are tipping points in institutions. So I'm going to shout out to Louise Chappell's work on international criminal law and her analysis of the ways in which at a certain point when you get a tipping point of representation, it doesn't undo some of the structural issues I've identified around representation, but the capacity to move change through those institutions is higher. So even as I'm critical of focusing on representation, I think we can't lose sight of the fact that there are actually these points at which you can change institutional structures by having like-minded individuals. They don't always have to be women, I think, functioning in those institutions. So that's perhaps a more positive note to end our lecture on. Thank you all, and we will pause and go on to break, and Aisling will be up next. Catherine's up next. Okay.